We don't necessarily have to read the sources inside. You can look at them just for reference, but I'll go through this rather quickly, and then in section B, Frank, you're the first one up. So if somebody looks through the corpus of the Torah, the 5 books of Moses, the Chumash, and looks for all of the different ways that people can be penalized for breaking some kind of law, these are the only options. And you'll notice very quickly what is missing. So the first one, which we do have today, and is an appropriate one, is a financial penalty. If somebody steals an ox from somebody, not only do they have to give it back, but there's often a financial penalty on top of that to discourage them from doing it later. And as an interesting side point, there are certain cases where if a thief decides to return it of their own free will, all kinds of different cases where the thief comes forward, the penalty goes away. And the reason is the rabbis wanted to encourage people to make penance, to make teshuvah. And if somebody said, I made a mistake, they don't want to hurt them. They don't want to punish them for coming forward and doing a good thing. But financial penalties are throughout the Torah, very clearly. The next one is in the more ritual realm, which is sin offerings. And the reason this is more ritual is, as we'll see, if somebody kills somebody in cold blood, bringing an animal sacrifice is not the way to get out of it. But if somebody breaks a ritual law, whether it's eating forbidden foods, breaking a holiday, and it's between human beings and God, then animal sacrifices can be a tool for resolving that. And while the temple's not standing today, this is a method that at least Jews and many religious people do when they've, sinned in a ritual matter, is to reach out to God and ask for forgiveness, i.e. Yom Kippur. The third one, which is the most extreme one, which is a class I have given also in the past about the death penalty, is in certain crimes when there was clear witnesses and the rabbis, again, there are dozens of classes that can go on about this, is when the death penalty can apply. It has to be a clear violation with clear witnesses. The rabbis also have to say the person has to be warned. Now, that means that me and one other kosher witness, so an observant Jewish male, and at least for the rabbi's understanding, would go to a person and say, do you know that if you bow down to that idol, the penalty is death? And the person says, I understand, and does it anyways, then they get the death penalty. Now, whether that was the standard of justice expected in the Torah did talk about clear testimony and witnesses, and it did talk about warning. But again, it's not clear exactly how that played out, because if it's a rabbinic system, then no one ever got the death penalty. It's almost impossible that you'd have a case of 2 guys happen to stand there and say, hey, did you know you're about to break Shabbos and they're going to put you to death? Oh, I forgot, I'm sorry. Usually doesn't happen, but the death penalty was a consequence for certain crimes that, at least in a meta sense, brought so much spiritual pollution to this world that a person could not fix it by paying money or bringing animal sacrifice. The fourth one is a very unique one, which in Hebrew is called karetz, literally, or kares, being cut off from heaven. And the understanding of that is that if somebody committed some grave sin, but there was no witnesses to it, so the traditional human systems of punishment, there's no human court to punish them or give consequences, God will take care of it. They actually have the phrase in the Talmud about the heavenly Beit Din, this court up in heaven. And for example, if somebody committed a crime and the punishment would be death through burning or something like that, and there were no fit witnesses, then a poisonous snake would come up and bite that person, because a poisonous bite is kind of burning. So when people say, how come this person doesn't get justice? The Torah says everyone gets justice now or later. And even if being cut off from heaven could also just mean they don't get to go to heaven. But it means that everyone will get consequences, whether it be by human hands or supernatural means. The fifth one is really, really important. And this will come up later, because this is the last one. It's corporal punishment, flogging, whipping. There's no prison. And if you ask rabbis about what did they do instead of prison, why didn't they have prisons, their answer would be, we didn't need prisons, we'd whip people. And that was essentially the system that and again, it's not for every little crime. Some minor crimes, the punishment is paying back money, saying you're sorry, animal sacrifice. But the kind of crimes that didn't deserve a death penalty, but were too egregious for the person to just be let to walk away, they would get whipped. Now, who can whip, under what circumstances, and the kind of whipping talked about in the Torah is different than the one the rabbis did, because the rabbis were using flogging for a long time after the destruction of the Second Temple. They might have been doing it in the 13, 14, 1500s on a communal level of whipping people, and the rabbis are explicit. You can only whip somebody if they can physically take it. In Jewish law, it's clear that a doctor is supposed to say, this person can survive 10 whips, 12 whips, 3 whips, up to 39, but no more. So the rabbis were conscious of, they didn't want to kill the person, but they wanted them to learn their lesson. Now, I said at the beginning, I am proposing here a different model than prison, but not in this section. I'm not suggesting that we should replace prisons with public flogging. The real question here is going to be, is there an underlying current, an underlying purpose to all of these punishments? What were they trying to accomplish? And I think that's the thing that we really want to get at, because if prison is trying to accomplish X goal and it's failing, then change the punishment. Flogging will not accomplish that goal today. It might have in certain parts of history. It might have accomplished that goal. So these are the only punishments that are talked about explicitly in the Torah. In a moment, we'll look at some rabbinic exceptions and additional ones, but these are the only options the Torah gives. Prison was not a part of the Torah, not a part of the prophets, the temples, and really barely came up in Jewish history at all, as we'll see in one moment. So any questions before we go on to the second section? And again, I'll pause for a moment to let people think. Those on the phones, again, at the end of the class, write your questions down. Excellent. Okay, so Frank, I'm gonna unmute you now, and I just have to get us to the second page. And what we're gonna look at right now are the idea of prison. So the idea of a prison or a cell does come up in the Torah, but there's something that we can, it's the way that it's used, the way that it's, the example of it tells us a lot about what our history thinks about prison. So the first example, I'll go ahead, Frank, from the book of Genesis, Bereshit, and the story of Joseph and his amazing technicolored dream coat. And this is, again, his brothers throw him into a pit, which clearly is an evil act. Then he ends up in the house of Potiphar, and Potiphar's wife tries to seduce Joseph, and he, like a good little Jewish boy, says, no, 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 I won't do anything. And then this is what happens.
So Joseph's master had him put into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. But even while he was there in prison, the Lord was with Joseph. He extended kindness to him and disposed the chief jailer favorably toward him.
Excellent. So there's a few things here. Anyone who points in this and says, oh, there were prisons in the Torah. First of all, this is not a Jewish prison. This was an Egyptian prison. And it was something that never showed up again, except for one interesting, we'll look at the next source. But also here, clearly God doesn't want him to be in there. God is changing the system. God does not want Joseph to go through the prison system. Clearly, obviously, he didn't commit a crime. We know that from being, outside of the story. But it's very clear here that this is an example of, not an example of where prison is a good tool. This is an example of a foreign power doing it, and God does not think he should be in there. So there's nothing we can learn from this that would say that prisons are something that we should consider. What's interesting is that's not the only thing that we get from Egyptian culture that ultimately we reject is coffins were introduced to our people, and it's in the Torah because Joseph, his bones were taken out in a coffin, his father too, I think just Joseph, and coffins were not the way that Jews or Israelites did burial. They were buried directly into the dirt of the ground, their bodies decomposed, and their bones were then put in a cave. And if you think about the story of Abraham in the cave of Machpelah, you're like, oh yeah, everyone's in a cave. Why are we in coffins in the ground? Well, that came much, much later, but it was an Egyptian practice that Joseph only had because he was essentially, almost an Egyptian prince. So they had a lot of influences on us, but we weren't supposed to adopt them. Myrna, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. I think you have to unmute yourself on your side.
Okay.
Excellent. And if you would go ahead and take Bamidbar, a fascinating story, and it kind of explains the story in and of itself from Bamidbar. Source 2, please.
Once, when the Israelites were in the wilderness, they came upon a man gathering wood on the Sabbath day. Those who found him as he was gathering wood brought him before Moses, Aaron, and the whole community. He was placed in custody, for it had not been specified what should be done to him.
Excellent, thank you. So there's a few things to point out. One is when it says he was put in custody, it says in the Hebrew bamishmar, and the word shamor is to guard. So it doesn't say he was put in a cell, but there is an understanding that the source implies that he was this person who was publicly doing something that would disgrace the Sabbath, but they didn't have, the Talmud or the Shulchan Aruch. They knew that this wasn't okay on Shabbat, but they didn't know what to do yet. In fact, maybe they knew it was forbidden, they didn't know the punishment yet. So they put him in some sort of temporary holding cell. So the only thing we can learn from this, and something that Jewish law might then validate, is that between the time someone commits a crime and the time they are sentenced, if there's a concern that either there'll be a continued threat or they're a flight risk, I think we'll see a later source on that, then it may be okay to temporarily put them in something. Now, he was only one person that was under lock and key. There was no big system. And we'll see sources later that do talk about how one should be treated, but the furthest that we could possibly say about these classical sources is that while someone is awaiting trial, it might be appropriate to put them under lock and key. However, even today that's abused because people who are not a flight risk, are not a threat to people, are left in jail because they can't pay bail. Even though they committed a crime and it's appropriate for them to go to trial, they end up sitting in jail for months or longer. So even that can be abused in that thing. Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you and you'll be the next one to read as well. But I saw you had your hand up. Go for it. You have to unmute yourself on your side as well.
I guess Mishmar, that's like under guard more, like someone watching, like house arrest or something. So not a cell.
So I brought it up because a lot of later sources kind of understand it as kind of a holding cell, or at least could be used as a source that kind of implies that it's appropriate in certain cases. And as I said, it can still be abused. But you're right, literally it just said is he put under guard. But part of the issue here is they didn't have prisons per se. They just didn't have jail. So if they had someone they wanted to hold for any reason, they didn't have a Beit Sohar, a house, a prison. They just have two guys guard him and keep him under house arrest, as it were.
The officials were furious with Jeremiah. They beat him and put him into prison in the house of the scribe Jonathan, where it had been made into a jail.
Excellent, thank you. So I'll explain the context of that. Is many of the prophets were speaking to a very unfavorable audience. In fact, I don't know if it's a pun, but a play on words when I said traitor to an unjust king. The king that he was speaking to was Tzidkiyahu, the Shorish, the root of his name, Tzedek, justice. But Jeremiah saw that the enemy soldiers were coming to conquer, and he said, don't fight them, because if you fight them, they'll kill us all. But if you basically bow down and let them exile us, we will live to fight another day. And the king said, how dare you? We're going to join together with our enemies to fight our other enemies. And it ended up leading to the destruction of the temple. So Yirmiyahu, history shows, was right. But the point is, when the king didn't like this public dissenter and he was against free press, as it were, he threw Jeremiah was thrown into jail by some of the king's advisors, and then the king supported that. But here again, it's an example of jail existing in our tradition, but it's explicitly clear here that it's being used by an evil king with an evil government for evil, nefarious purposes, that there's no justice in this jail. So again, historically, the concept of a jail existed, but it was only used, or wasn't used anyway like the way that we hope it would be used today. Excellent, thank you, Ken. All right, so the next person I see, Lynn here. I'm unmuting you.
Okay.
And this source here is really interesting because, again, it's a historical source. It's the Talmud now. So we're, post the destruction of both temples. And perhaps what it's talking about here, it's the Mishnah. So we're talking 3rd century. So this is something not so far removed from the Second Temple, destroyed in the 1st century. But this is a very, very disturbing use of a prison. So I brought it because it shows a use of a cell for a certain kind of criminal. But you'll see here as you read it, Lynn, why this is so deeply disturbing. Go for it. Source number 4, yeah.
Mishnah. One who was flogged for violating a prohibition and then repeated the violation and was flogged again assumes the status of a forewarned transgressor. The court places him into the vaulted chamber, would that be la kippah?
Yeah, to a kippah. Yeah, to the kippah, la kippah.
And feeds him barley bread until his belly ruptures due to the low quality food and he dies?
Yes. So as I said, this is, again, a historical example of where the rabbis did institute something that was akin to a jail, but the way they used it, again, there was no concept of leaving someone in jail indefinitely as a punishment. That concept didn't exist. You don't put people in jail as a punishment. The goal of jail, as we'll see very shortly in some of the sources, was either as a means to an end towards someone's trial and ultimate punishment or consequence, or they would do some other consequence. But here, the way they're using it is this is somebody who continuously does the same transgression. So it's not somebody who on Monday breaks Yom Kippur and on Tuesday steals and on Thursday publicly eats some forbidden food. It's somebody who's consistently doing the same crime, and presumably it's not a minor thing. It's not somebody who keeps eating chicken and cheese together. It's somebody who's doing something really egregious that's affecting society, not a murderer, although potentially it could be a murderer who keeps getting away with it on technicalities, but it's somebody who, because either of a technicality or they keep doing the same crime, they keep getting whipped. So this also says the rabbis were using the whipping in the early centuries, and the rabbis can't do anything, and it's clear to them that this person is a danger to society and they are not improving. Which hints there that the goal of all this whipping is to make somebody a better person, to rehabilitate them, but it's failing miserably. So what do? They put him in a cell, they feed him lots of dry bread, barley bread, dry bread, no water. And again, I don't know if scientifically, I don't know if there's any doctors, anyone who has enough medical knowledge to know if this could happen, but they feed him a lot of bread and then they force feed him water. I think they say this about not doing rice at weddings because this could happen to the birds. They drink the water and then it causes some sort of rupture in the belly and they die. So they didn't kill this person right out, but it is a backwards way of essentially taking this person out of the world. So I am not suggesting this. I think no rabbi would suggest this today, but again, it shows that actually it's not a good source for prisons or jails. Because even though they talk about a kippah, this kind of cell, the point is not to leave them in the cell. The point is to put them in there to lead to their ultimate punishment. And again, don't do it. But that's, again, we've seen nothing here that suggests that prison in any way should be the end. And then this final source here, I'll just take it, read it outside, is there's a blessing, the Akata Gomel, for thanks to God that many people do when they survive a surgery or something dangerous. They say it in synagogue during the Torah service. And there's a listed number of things for why they say it. Someone who's gone on a great journey, traveled through the desert. Historically, these were more common back then. And one is somebody who was incarcerated in prison. And the universal understanding from all commentaries is that this was a non-Jewish prison. And part of that is because the understanding of the rabbis was anyone who went into a secular jail would be treated very, very poorly, as opposed to someone who went through the rabbinic system. Not that they wouldn't, not get a consequence. Whipping is obviously quite egregious, but the rabbinic understanding is that all our punishments at least try to be fair and appropriate for the crime that was committed. Even the death penalty, in the ideal world, whether or not you're supportive of the death penalty, but if there is a death penalty, it's meant to be appropriate to the crime that was committed. And the rabbis understood that in the non-Jewish system, and this is not me attacking, non-Jews in the way they do courts, but for the rabbis in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries, the way that non-Jews typically treated Jews in their prison system was an incredibly dangerous situation, life or death. And if someone survived that, then they would thank God for it. So I'm going to pause there again for a moment before we go on to the next section. Excellent. Beautiful. This next section here is really important because we're actually going to start getting to potentially some practical advice that certain countries, and I forget if it's Sweden or Denmark, but one of those countries has attempted a very different model of prison. They do still have people serve out their time. They're certainly not whipping people, which again, I'm not for, but they have them go to these, I don't know if penal colony might be the better phrase for it, but they have people go to these prisons and they're allowed to go home at night, or they're in certain houses, and they basically, they have them serve time separated from society as a consequence for their actions, but it's not locked up in a tiny hole. So it's already saying there's a model of separating people from society, but still treating them with human dignity. And when someone's treated as a human being, then they feel like a human being, and they're actually open to growing and potentially rehabilitating, at least in many cases. And the model that we learn that from is one that, again, I don't suggest today, but we can learn a great deal from it. And that model, Leonard and Gloria, I'm unmuting you. Gloria, if you would take, this is from Rambam's Mishnah Torah, and he talks about something that is in the Torah. I didn't bring it as one of the punishments because it's not quite a direct punishment, but it is a method of consequence for someone who's a thief specifically. So go for it, please. Source number 1.
The term Hebrew servant used by the Torah refers to a Jew whom the court sells by compulsion, or a person who sells himself willingly. What is implied? When a person steals and does not have the resources to repay the principal, the court sells him, as we have explained in Hilchot Geneva.
A geneva, from the word lignov, to steal, or you might have heard in Yiddish, a ganef.
Yeah.
So he's talking here again about an institution that's in the Torah that we've gotten away with today, it's slavery. However, the way that the Torah, at least for a fellow Jew, for non-Jews in the Hebrew, Eved Kanani, a Canaanite slave, laws were a little bit different, although the rabbis still required, and we'll see that in the next source, that we treat even a non-Jewish slave with respect. But here we're talking about indentured servitude. Now, even in the early days of slavery in the United States of America was clearly slavery. I think some people may have said indentured servitude, but it wasn't. It was real slavery. Here, and in Roman times as well, where something like, 80% of the population were slaves, is they weren't the slaves that we think of either in Egypt or here in the Americas. When the people were brought from Africa, that was just slavery. They had zero freedom whatsoever. This is a different model. This is somebody who either can't pay a debt, and there's someone rich and they say, if you pay off my debts, I will work for you for 2 years, 3 years, whatever the going rate is. I'm worth $15 a day. There's a whole book on the Talmud that talks about how much is a person worth, or somebody who's a thief and they can't pay it back. So this isn't rot in jail. This isn't we beat the person. We say, work off your debt to society. But they're not living in a jail cell. They're living in someone's house. And in fact, I don't know if they might even be able to live in their own home. They can be with their family. This is so different from the classical evil model of slavery. And again, I'm not suggesting this, but I think it's getting closer towards a model that could be more effective today, which the goal here is not to make someone suffer and be punished for punishment's sake. It's to say they took something away from society in this world, and they have to try their darndest to make up for it. Now, obviously, that doesn't work for all crimes. It doesn't work with murder, which is why the Torah doesn't have indentured servitude in murder. Capital punishment is the punishment, or a heavenly punishment. But if someone steals and they can't pay back, work it off. And we'll see here, actually, Leonard, I'll have you take in the next source here. One of the issues is you'd say, oh, that's nice, everyone work off your debt. But what happens is it'll just turn into the whole same abusive system. And in an ideal world, at least, it wouldn't, because, go ahead, Leonard.
The way of wisdom is for a person to be merciful and to pursue justice, not to make his slaves carry a heavy yoke, nor cause them distress. He should allow them to partake of all the food and drink he serves.
Excellent. Now, again, this is the ideal, which is where the person who's working for them, and they don't have a choice, they're required, which is why it's not total freedom, it's still that indentured servitude, but they are treated like a member of the household. Now, was it always done perfectly? I doubt it. Are there exceptions to the rule whereby the master could mistreat the person working for them? Was there a difference between the way Jews and non-Jews were often treated? All of that is true, which is why ultimately this is not we shouldn't automatically do the system, because it lends itself to abuse. If our American system, which is certainly doesn't look like indentured servitude, it's so easy to lead to direct physical and mental abuse of prisoners, certainly a system like this would be open to that. However, the Torah says, and the rabbis do clarify, that if somebody or an indentured servant is not treated with respect, or they're injured in any way, boom, they're free. If the master does not treat them with dignity, then they absolutely leave the system. This system only works because the goal is to make the person a better person when they're treated like a person. And again, I'll pause there. The rabbis understand that all of the punishments, other than certainly ending their life, which by the way is helping them, because the only way for somebody to receive true kapara, atonement, when they've killed someone, is for them to die themselves. The only chance that they have to get into heaven, to get good with God, is to actually, to have their lives ended. But all of these punishments are put in place to make people better members of society. But that will never happen unless we treat them as members of society. That's what the Rambam is saying here, and we'll see that in the later sources. There's one other interesting thing here that I'll just summarize number 3, because I just have to explain what it is, and then I'll have someone read source number 4. In the Torah, if somebody killed someone, but it was accidental, if it's on purpose, they intend to kill someone and there are witnesses, death penalty. But if it's truly an accidental thing, they get into some kind of fight or a car accident, whatever it is, it's a terrible thing they have to have on their conscience, on their soul, but they don't deserve to die for it. However, the family of the survivors have a right to go after the killer. So what does this person do? The justice system won't kill him, but the family could. So what does he do if he doesn't deserve to die? He goes to an Ir Miklat, a refugee or sanctuary city, and he lives out, not forever. The person lives there until whoever the current high priest, the Kohen Gadol, dies, which could be 1 year, 2 years, 10 years. Now, there are a number of things that we can learn from this. One is, even though it was accidental, the rabbis say there's no such thing as pure accidents. This person messed up. They don't deserve death, but they don't deserve to go about their life normally. So this is seen as a kind of punishment, a sort of exile. But again, this exile is one where they can take their family. They go to a city where they can get a job, live in a home, live a normal life. It is them being uprooted from their own home, which is very painful. But there's still that loss of freedom that's included in it. However, they can still go home, whether it's in 10, 15, 20 years. Why? Because the goal here is not the punishment. And that leads to source number 4. And Susan, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you could go ahead and take this source from the Talmud, source number 4, go for it.
Talmud Bavli, Makot, 11b, and perhaps with regard to this one who was already exiled, his sin was atoned for by his exile, and therefore the death of the high priest facilitates his return. But that one who is not yet exiled, no, his sin was not atoned for, and the death of the high priest should not prevent his exile. The Gemara rebuts. Is it his exile that atones for his sin? It is the death of the high priest that atones for his sin, and the high priest died.
Excellent, thank you. So I had mentioned there's this notion in the Torah, and it may seem archaic and very primal to us, that when blood of a human being is spilled, the only way to bring balance is for the blood of the guilty person to be spilled. Everything has to balance out. Now today, again, that was another class, the question of, did the rabbis really feel that was still appropriate or ever appropriate, and generally, listen to the class. I won't go into it here. However, here they understand that the person, even if he accidentally killed someone, the only way to bring balance is for blood to be spilled. But he's not, or he or she is not really a murderer. So how do we bring balance? So what they do is they go into this temporary exile. And then when the high priest dies, and it could be natural causes, they don't have to be killed, that death will bring back balance. But this is also an opportunity, as I said, for the person in exile to recognize what were the mistakes that led them to this, whether it was contemporary times drunk driving or getting drunk in a bar or anger, all these things. They have time to realize their mistakes. And then the atonement on a spiritual level will happen when the high priest dies. But the goal, as I said before, the goal of all of these is to get somebody back into society and to make that process as dignified and appropriate to the crime as possible. Even flogging was generally not seen as something that would be disgraceful to the person. It was seen as a consequence to tell them to, be better. And even this idea of the penal colony being exiled, it's not to disgrace the person. It's not to make them feel like dirt. And I've never been in a prison, not as an inmate, and I haven't had an opportunity to go in as a chaplain, which I probably should, and I think many rabbis probably should. But my understanding is that forget about the physical conditions being small and it just being miserable to be there. It's not like the guards are trying to make the experience better. I have talked to people who've worked in prisons, and you don't necessarily want to become buddy-buddy with these people, but a lot of times they are just not given the basic human dignity. They're treated like dirt, and oftentimes they ended up being criminals because they were treated like dirt. And what happens is, the more they're treated like dirt, they just stay in that role. If someone's beaten down long enough, it's really hard for them to get up again. And it seems clear from all of these sources that every punishment is meant to get someone back into society and up on their feet. So before we look at some contemporary sources that said everything I just said much better than me, are there any questions or comments so far? And again, those who are on the phone, you'll have an opportunity to share some thoughts at the end. So we're going to look at two somewhat modern sources here. Now, what I've done is brought sources from, the post or the early exilic time, after the destruction of the Second Temple, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th century. And then the question is, so what happened during all those generations? There wasn't necessarily capital punishment, although there might have been something in Eastern Europe, the Council of the Four Lands, where they certainly could financially penalize people. There might have been capital punishment, but there are a number of sources, maybe a dozen or so, of rabbis who go back and forth about using prison. And the reason that question comes up is because everyone else was. And it was a method that was available to them. And I'm not talking here about them handing over Jews to the non-Jewish government, because what we saw earlier is generally as Jews, we don't like to do that because we don't feel like Jews are treated fairly. And in fact, it's actually considered a great sin to hand over a Jew. And this is a great sin in the 11th, 10th centuries when the non-Jewish governments were deeply anti-Semitic. So in Nazi Germany, for example, if somebody, a Jew, were to turn over a fellow Jew to the Nazis, even before the Holocaust, because they were trying to be a good German citizen, that would be a great sin, because the way that Jew would be treated, even if they were a thief, the chances are they probably would have been put to death. So this is talking about a time when the non-Jewish governments or monarchies or kingships would absolutely mistreat the Jews, and their justice would be far harsher and unfair than Jewish justice. So the rabbis here are not arguing about should we be handing over Jews to be in non-Jewish jails. They're saying the non-Jews have this thing called prison. We could use that as a tool. Should we? And there are a number of rabbis that are generally supportive in saying, even though this isn't really consistent with the punishments in the Torah, we don't have that anymore. And this is the tool of the day. So one of that tension, metach, between the Torah's value and using tools that actually worked during their time comes up in this Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshet, 14th century Spain. And you can hear the tension in his words and the pain as he's trying to respond to not just the question, but the fact that some of his fellow rabbis were using jails for Jews. And he said, how do I feel about this? So Lynn, I'm actually around to you again, if you're able to unmute yourself on your side. And if you could go ahead and take source number 1 from the Rivash, which is an acronym for the Rabbi Yitzchak ben Sheshet. Go for it.
Okay, the truth is, in my own city, the judge's custom is to imprison a person who in this manner, according to an act of the community. And they further enacted that even without being found guilty, any person can be held over a lawsuit unless they pay collateral, and they called this a ruling of the court. I did not want to allow this act to stand, because it is not in accordance with our Torah's law. And they said to
So just pointing out what you've seen so far kind of sounds like bail. So the rabbis were putting people in jail unless they could, pay off their debt, as it were. And he says, this is not in accordance with Torah law. He's quite explicit. But the rabbis of his town are doing it. So go ahead, Lynn.
And they said to me, this is in accordance with the Marketplace Act, a principle allowing new rules that make commerce smoother because of swindlers, and so as not to bar the door in the face of borrowers. And I allowed their custom to stand.
Now, there's a lot to unpack here about the development of society and capitalism, et cetera, like that. Essentially, what they're saying here is, if we go by the Torah standards, and the fact that we don't have the temple today, a lot of our punishments and consequences we can't use. And these rabbis are living in lands where they don't have the authority to, do a lot of these things. So they say, if we don't have any of our classical forms of consequences, then these are going to run rampant. And what's going to happen is Jews they're going to close up shop. No one's going to go into business because they're going to say the rabbis don't protect us. So what they did is they said, look, we have to protect the market. And this isn't just, let capitalism run wild. They mean like literally the marketplace, like the actual direct livelihood. If they don't do something to discourage thieves, it's going to run rampant. So they said, we have this tool that, we don't like it. It's not consistent with Torah law, but it's the only thing we have. So the Rivash, obviously, if he felt it was completely forbidden by the Torah, he couldn't have allowed it. I think what he means by not in accordance or not consistent with Torah law is more like we have a different set of values, whereby the goal, again, is to rehabilitation. We don't believe in just throwing someone in jail and letting them rot there, but it's not forbidden. It's just not part of our value system, and it doesn't reflect the values that we hold when we're trying to rehabilitate someone. But it's the best thing we have right now, so he says, I let it stand. And again, if you look at the dozens of sources, they go back and forth and take a stand on both sides. And by the way, you'll see the Rivash come up again later. It may not be referring to this specific statement, but he was very important for the development of Jewish law. Now, a lot of this was, even though this was clearly a practical question, the idea of Jews setting up a prison system was pretty much theoretical for the most part until the modern state of Israel, which leads us to our last two sources, which is this Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who in the 20th century was the chief rabbi of Tel Aviv, a number of years ago. And he wrote a beautiful book of Tshuvot. And I brought two different Tshuvot from him. The first one here actually talks about a time when he feels that prison or jail, depending on how you look at it, might be appropriate. So Ken, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you. And if you would go ahead and take this, you're just going to go ahead for the source number 2, please.
There is no question that in the case of a transgressor, where there is a concern that he will be punished with capital punishment, that the court is obligated to hold the person and to imprison him in jail until it is clear to them that there will not be capital punishment, but only monetary punishment.
So pause there. This is consistent with our early sources, which is he's not in jail or prison for the sake of being in prison. He is there while they clarify what the punishment is. And again, we'll see in what his next tshuva, what that experience should be like, how that he or she should be treated there. So the first one, it's not prison for prison's sake. It's a temporary holding cell, so jail, not prison, jail, until they can figure out what is the appropriate consequence. Go for it.
And we don't let him out on bail, for if the person sees that he will be sentenced to capital punishment, he will flee and will be sentenced. He will flee. And also in the case of one who has committed a crime, there is a concern of capital punishment. It is not appropriate that this person shall go walk around in the marketplace while the court deliberates about a sentence.
So again, pause there, just sorry, for a moment, is we're not talking here about low-level infractions, people going in jail because they jaywalked. These are people who might have either accidentally killed someone, and then they have to, have some kind of sentence, or they might be a real murderer. But these are high-level, crimes that these people are committing. So when he says no bail, again, it's not somebody who was caught drunk or, something like, or who was speeding. It's somebody who could potentially be a real threat. Either they might really be a flight risk because the punishment might be serious, even if they deserve it. And the question of what does it mean they deserve it? I'm saying within the context of this system of capital punishment, if that feels they deserve it, they might run away, or they might be a real danger. So again, here, if this is speaking to us today in the 21st century, this is speaking about very few people. If we held this standard about who should be held temporarily in jail, it would be an insignificant fraction of the number of people that are thrown in and left many times to rot. Sorry, go ahead, Ken.
Okay. We learned from the words of the Ribash that one who is arrested for a crime that is likely to result in capital punishment or any bodily crime is not freed on bail until after his judgment is determined. And from this we learned that for all other crimes for which the punishment is monetary, we let them go on bail until the determination of the sentence.
Excellent. So it is prison or jail, again, jail, which is not a long-term thing. Jail is only meant to be temporary until the appropriate consequences can be decided upon. And then it is only for people who are a threat or who have physically injured someone. It is not for monetary crimes. Now, he does say explicitly, and someone can get on bail, which one of the issues in the American system is most people, or a lot of people who get in jail, cannot afford bail. So there needs to be reform there. But again, what do the Jewish sources have to say about prison and jail? It is for people who are actually a threat, who have shown through physical actions. It's not for people who have committed financial crimes. Not that they should get off scot-free. And potentially they might even go into jail for a very short time, but their ability to get out, if they're not a real threat, should be a very low threshold. Putting people behind bars is to prevent them from injuring other people, and very quickly, we need to figure out the appropriate consequence. But again, even here, there really is no place for any kind of prison or jail system, even though he recognizes it in a limited way. But the final source from Rabbi Chaim David Halevi is really beautiful, because this is, and it should be the takeaway of tonight, which is even in a system where there is prison and there is jail, whether it's the limited model he suggested, or whether it really is people who are put in jail for 20 years, how do we treat those people? What should the prison system look like? And we've seen it hinted at by the Rambam when he talked about indentured servitude. So I'll take this final source here. By all opinions, punishment is not a goal unto itself. So now you know where I got that from. When I was saying that over and over again, you know where I learned it from. Rather, it is intended to return the criminal to doing right, or so that they will listen in fear. What benefit is prison from this perspective? It's a really good question. The punishment of prison has existed in different forms forever. So even though we didn't see it in the Torah that the Jews were doing, it was in the Torah. There was such a thing as prison. And experience proves that imprisonment does not rehabilitate the criminal. So he's not writing here in the 13th century, so he could have seen, some of the content. There have been studies for the last couple hundred years about how broken the prison system is, but it was apparent to him, and it should be apparent to us how broken it is. In addition to this, it also causes further harm after his or her release from prison. There is serious concern that additional crimes will come his way in the absence of any other choice. Now, why exactly that happens, and is it consistent? Everyone who goes to prison, do they end up becoming a worse criminal? No, but it is very, very common. And he's really picking up on that. Not only is prison not helping or improving the situation, it's making it much, much worse. But we have brought this to learn from the foundation of the Holy Torah's perspective on human freedom and the social nature of the human being, created in the image of God. Everyone, even a murderer, is created in the image of God. That no other person has the right to confine the human spirit or his freedom of movement, or his freedom, which are holy of holies among all creations in the image of God. The one thing that we all have, the most beautiful and godly thing about all of us, is our freedom, our ability to choose our own destiny. And in each generation, we must devise appropriate punishments for criminals that are consistent with the Torah's outlook and with the conditions of life. He's not suggesting we bring back flogging. He's saying that in every generation, we need to think about what is our goal: to rehabilitate. What tool is going to get us there? What method is going to get us there? Certain countries have found excellent methods that are working. Now, they're smaller countries. They're doing it on a smaller scale with less serious crimes. The United States is a little bit different, but it's clear that our methods are not working if our goal is to rehabilitate human beings with dignity. One of the great legal minds of our generation said, "It is our obligation to be concerned about just law," not like only law, but law that is just. More than that, it is our obligation to be concerned about the criminal himself. More than that is our obligation to be concerned with the dignity of humanity. Unfortunately, almost every one of these lists, as he expands out to what we should be concerned about, are not apparent in the criminal justice system in our country and in others as well. And we will add, in the spirit of our holy Torah, the greatest of our obligations is to be concerned with the Tselem Elohim, being created in the image of God, which is in humanity. For in the image of God, God created humanity. And the idea here is that that godly spark is in everyone, even a true criminal. And because of that, we have an obligation to try and bring that out of them. And there were times in history where it was clear that that person had polluted themselves so much, the only way to bring out their godliness was to end their life. But that wasn't just to make them suffer. That was to save them from the evil they had become. But the goal here is to find the godliness in each person and bring it out. And for somebody who stole a loaf of bread and is thrown in jail for decades, there's nothing godly about that. And in no way is anyone recognizing the humanity, the godliness, and the holiness that is potential in all of us. Can every person be rehabilitated? No, of course not. To Jews, and now I speak, as I said, this class is directed to us as the Jewish community. Do we have an obligation to try? Should the state of Israel make sure that their justice system is guided by these values? Absolutely. Could the United States justice system have a lot to learn from this? And if this became their goal, would prisons and jails look drastically different? Absolutely they would. And please God, not only with the protest here, because prisons, as I said in last class, by far, absolutely, totally imbalanced affect minority and the Black communities. We need to start that change now. Because again, if the goal is to make people suffer and rot in a hole, we're doing a great job. If the goal is to recognize people's humanity and return them to society and improve society as a whole, we are failing as a people in general.